Good evening and welcome to this lecture organised by the British-Yemeni Society. Um, my name is Noel Brehony and I'll moderate this event as our current chairman, James Firebrace, is unavailable. Like Helen, I lived in the PDRY, but in the early days, 2 years after it became independent, as the People's Republic of South Yemen, as it was known until 1970. It was a very difficult period. A few years earlier, Aden, still then a British colony, had been the second busiest port in the world, rather like Dubai today. The Suez Canal, which was critical to port traffic, was closed by the June War of 1967 and didn't reopen until 1975, by when international shipping had adjusted to its loss, with a drastic impact on port traffic at Aden and the economy of the new country. The departure of British troops and personnel and many others linked to administration and the economy further damaged the economy. And the two main parties contesting for independence, the NLF, National Liberation Front, and FLOSSY, the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, fought each other in the streets of Aden only a few months before independence. The NLF, which took control on the 30th of November 1967, was united in fighting its enemies, but internally divided. The former Federal Army was a large and coherent force that might have threatened to take power in that era of military coups. The new state thus had a very difficult inheritance, and its survival was in doubt. I arrived just after the left wing of the NLF had taken power. It was called, in the terms used in those days, the glorious corrective step. And the atmosphere, but I found an atmosphere of fear induced by frequent cross-border attacks from the enemies of the NLF and disputes within the NLF between left and right. Yet it did survive. It not only survived, but thrived, and remains today a symbol of southern statehood. When I talk to young South Yemenis, I'm struck by how little people know about the PDRY. Some recall or imagine the good days that I'm sure Helen will refer to. Others recall the internal strife that eventually helped bring it down. But I can think of no one better than Helen Lackner to set all this in context, to show where it succeeded, where it failed, and why. She lived in the PDRY for more than half of its existence and met many of the leaders. She needs no introduction to this audience as the author and editor of several outstanding books on Yemen, including a marvelous one on the PDRY itself, and most recently, Why Yemen Matters and Yemen in Crisis. If you want to ask questions, please do so by using the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen, and I'll put these to Helen after the lecture. If there are problems with viewing the webinar, please use the chat function and Ibrahim Zanta will help you. I'd like to thank Ibrahim for his work in setting up and managing this webinar. So without further ado, please over to Helen.
Good evening, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, depending on where people are, as I don't know where everybody is. And thank you, Noel and the British-Yemeni Society for inviting me to talk. And when I was asked to talk about the PDRY, my first reaction was, oh, not again, I've said everything I have to say on the topic. So I thought about this and realized that I may have said it, but not everybody's heard it. And secondly, more importantly, I wanted to look at it in a slightly different way. So I decided to focus on the PDRY in its international context. And I'm not just talking about the PDRY in its international context, I'm also going to talk about its origins in the international context. And this is where, the first thing I'm going to ask everybody who is attending this today, those of you who are old enough, try and remember what life was like in the 60s and the 70s, or at least if not your personal lives, at least the general environment you were living in. And for the younger ones, try and imagine a completely different world. And the first example I will give you, just think of a world in which the absolute best favorite ally of the US in the Middle East was not Saudi Arabia, Iran. Iran was the gendarme of the US and the great ally of, again, guess who? Israel. This is the kind of world that we were talking about in those days. So we have to really completely restructure ourselves and, think back at a totally different world. And so I'm going to very briefly remind you, or tell those of you who have never had any interest in this matter, of a few basic, what were basic facts of life for many of us in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I wasn't that conscious in the 50s, but I was pretty well around in the 60s. And very much looking, I mean, I'm afraid I'm not, in the time we have, going to do a correct historical chronological situation description, but I want to just give a feel of the important things. And again, I think I'd like to say that for some of the older ones here, their vision will be very, very different from mine, but it's still worth looking at these points. So the emergence of something like the NLF was connected and took place in the context of the Sino-Soviet dispute, and we will see later that that was relevant. Many of the policies that were implemented by the NLF and later the YSP emerged from what happened on the left in Europe. And I think, again, this was one of the most positive aspects of the Cold War, was that both the East and the West were competing for popular support. And they did this primarily by providing social services. And I think that's something we'll come to a bit later. Again, when we look at the movement of the led to independence in Aden in 1967, we also have to look at it in the context of the overall process of decolonization. 1960 was the year when most African states became independent. This were not the first. I mean, obviously, India and Pakistan had happened long before, and other parts of countries that were not connected with, with British colonialism, but with others, for example, Indonesia, etc., and France, of course, in Southeast Asia. That brings me to another very important element which had a considerable influence on the situation in Yemen, which was the Vietnam War, which when the American episode of the Vietnam War was 65 to 75. And, another revolutionary aspect that was also very influential for Yemen and Yemenis was Cuba. Now, of course, the Cuban Revolution was in 1959, but, the regime turned very left in the 60s, and it had much influence by many Cubans, mainly Cuban medical staff, being present in Yemen and after independence, and in many other countries. And I think it's also worth mentioning very briefly the impact or the existence of the non-aligned movement, because that was an attempt by third world countries, led by many amongst them NASA, to have a movement that was neither East nor West. But the fundamental issue that dominated, the international impact was the East-West conflict. And I think, we'll come back to it a bit later. And it's really important to keep those things in mind, which is why this is the only slide on this in this talk, because I want people to have this in mind in front of them while we talk about these detailed aspects of the situation. So now I'll go very briefly into a bit of talk of what happened in the Middle East in particular. Of course, Israel was established in 1948, and there were a number of wars leading to that. And that had two impacts. First, it had an impact on an increase and rise of Arab nationalism, and in particular, of course, of Nasserism. And the other side of it were, the wars that happened and the rise of different types of regimes. So Nasserism had its peak moment or peak period between 54 and 67. And, during that time, we also again have a minor Yemeni implication when the Imamate joined the United Arab Republic from 58 to 61. There's various comic stories to go with this. I won't go into them now. But very importantly, you had the nationalization of the Suez Canal and a form of Arab socialism, which was the Nasserist Arab socialism was in competition with the two Ba'athist Arab socialisms you had in Iraq and Syria. So these were elements which were very influential in developing the thinking and the beliefs of the people who joined the, who became leaders in the PDRY later, and indeed in other parts of Yemen and in many other countries. And I think if you look in the peninsula, you know, you had, I mean, throughout the Arab world, you had the emergence of nationalist movements. And as I said, we had Nasserisms, we had the Ba'athist movements, we had the movement of Arab nationalists, which started in 1958, which really was at the origin of both some of the socialist movements and some of the much more left-wing movements, and had an important role in the Arabian Peninsula in particular. It was connected with movements in Kuwait. It was connected with the labor movements that emerged in Saudi Arabia, or actually maybe the labor movements in Saudi Arabia in the 50s were more incentives to its development. And of course, it was very much at the origin of much of the Palestinian movements. So very, very briefly, if we look at that period throughout, we have to look in the peninsula at, you know, or in the Arab world at a kind of conflict between socialist regimes in the very much the loosest sense of definition of that particular word, and the monarchy regimes. And you know, what is now the United Arab Emirates, which was then basically no more than the Trucial Oman state under very the type of Britain, don't need to go into that, but only became the UAE in 1971. It will be the 50th anniversary next year. We're still, it's a very young state. We had, again, in that area from 65 to 75, you had the movement, the revolutionary movement in Oman, you know, fighting the Sultan, and initially also claiming to be involved in the whole of what was then known as the Trucial Oman state, so a claim which never became more than a claim, basically. And all of this was supervised, one could say, by the wonderful alliance between the US and Iran. And the Shah of Iran was, you know, a major element of politics in the region until basically his overthrow in 1979. So we're talking about phenomena which were very, very relevant throughout the 60s and 70s. And I think as we go into discussing the Yemen situation, you know, the most active period in Yemen and the most revolutionary period was indeed the 70s, but we will come to that. I'd like briefly to give a very short sort of introduction repeating the kind of movements that led to independence, that led to a different type of thinking, of a republican thinking in Yemen. And if we start in the 50s, you know, I've got three elements I just want to mention briefly. First, as I mentioned it earlier, the presence of, or the participation of the imamate in Sana'a in the United Arab Republic. You know, however symbolic it was, it certainly had an impact for some people. The second element, which I think is, you know, directly related to what happened later in the South, was the rise of the labor movement in Aden. Now, that labor movement arose from the activities of the port and the activities of the base, and was happening in the days of the British colonial rule, and very much was connected with the labor movements in Britain. And so you had a kind of to and fro learning process, I think, going. And also that, you know, this labor movement in Aden could also be involved with connections with people in other countries. And the third one, which is also from that period, but even more in the 60s, was the Yemeni migration to the UK, the US, and other places, because that helped also a sort of to and fro movement of thinking and of ideas that helped to develop and different approaches in Yemen in particular. And that was both in terms of practical things, such as, you know, knowing and being aware of welfare systems. And secondly, you know, thinking in terms of political thinking and decolonial thinking. So very, even more briefly, going into the 60s, I'd like to, you know, in Aden, what did you have in the 60s? You had the People's Socialist Party that became later FLOSI, and which was very close to the Nasserite movement, though I think there were some differences. You had, of course, in Sana'a, you had the 26th of September revolution, followed by the very heavy Egyptian involvement, which was something which I think had a strong impact on Yemenis' perceptions of Nasser and Nasserisms. I think even many Republicans were very uncomfortable, to put it mildly, about what was happening or the way the Egyptians were approaching their country and treating them. In 1963, you had the National Liberation Front created. Now, again, if you look at the NLF and what it was in its origins, it was very much a mix between some tribal leaders or some independent thinkers and a few intellectuals who had been influenced by the movement of Arab nationalists. And they certainly became much more prominent. So you had an anti-colonial liberation movement in Aden in the 60s, which, as many of us know from the history, was not merely a movement against the British. If you look at what was happening in the last years of that movement, of the actual fighting in Aden, there was almost as much fighting going on between FLOSI and the NLF as there was between either against Britain. I think Noel had briefly alluded to that in his introduction. So when you got independence in Aden in 1967, and you had the People's Republic of South Yemen, you had, and I think now I will talk briefly about the political aspect of things before moving to, I think, the more positive aspects, namely the sort of social aspects. And I think Noel's already pointed out that, factionalism and within the movement and within its leadership was a very, very major issue throughout the 23 years of existence of the regime in Aden. But also, and I think that's important to remember, that yes, I think there was a lot of factionalism and there was a lot of differences and personality difference, but there was, the people, the leadership did have good reason to believe that they were under attack from the outside world, because there was, basically every faction that was defeated, starting with the ones who were defeated before independence, and everyone later then would move either to Sana'a or to Riyadh and then start armed or other incursions or attacks against the PDRY. So it's not surprising that the leadership felt under attack, because actually it was under attack a lot of the time. But that doesn't totally justify what happened. So as Noel pointed out, in 1969, you had the first big overthrow of the right, which he calls a glorious corrective step. I've always called it the glorious corrective move. I'm not sure which of us is right, but it doesn't really matter. And, that movement in 1969, it basically, I think, excluded from the leadership those elements which were neither movement of Arab nationalists, nor Soviet-inclined socialists, nor Chinese-inclined socialists, nor any, basically, I would say, those who were in favor of independence and possibly not particularly ideologically motivated, because many of those who had been ideologically motivated had already left before 67 or at independence immediately. Then the next issue you had was in 1972, when there were, a number of officers and others were dismissed or imprisoned. And you then had that was one set of incursions coming from both the North and Saudi, which was also coincided, the 70s, with 3 or 4 of the major reforms of the PDRY, and which also marked, if you look at the evolution of policies in the PDRY in the 1970s, you also see the evolution from what was known as it's characterized and described as pro-Chinese, pro-cultural revolution, or pro-Soviet, or populist versus bureaucratic. I don't think any of those labels are particularly fantastically useful, but I've used them myself, basically in the inability of finding better ones. So if you look at 1972, it was also the year of the 7 days events. The 7 days, most people have forgotten all about the 7 days. It was a week of demonstrations by the people in the streets of Aden, demanding and calling for their salaries to be reduced. You did hear me right, I did say reduced. It came, of course, at a time when the regime was under incredible financial and economic pressure. As Noel has pointed out, it had lost the income of the Aden port, which they had expected to be the major income after independence. It had less surprisingly lost all the income connected with the British presence and the British base. And it was, because of the hostility of all the surrounding regimes, it was extremely short of money. So it's not at all surprising that the regime was suggesting that, that the salaries had to be reduced. But persuading the people to come out in the streets and calling for it was certainly a political move, which was later associated very much with Salmin and with the group that was associated with the pro-Chinese element. The earlier reform of 1970, the agrarian reform, which was a very important reform that gave land to the poorer elements in the rural areas, what was particularly revolutionary about that, and particularly some people would say ultra-leftist about that, was not the actual law, it was the mechanism for its implementation. Again, the people were encouraged, and the farmers were encouraged to come out and to call for and to get rid of the landlords by force. And there were cases of, distinct misbehavior and ill treatment of landlords and possibly even killings, which later on in the 90s, after unification, one got the reverse process, which we won't be talking about at this point. And the other important, laws were, of course, the 1974 family law, which, other than the one in Tunisia, was the most progressive in the Arab world, and which gave women a lot of rights, and which was certainly one of the particular handles used by the people against the regime to attack it, by saying it was going against the traditions. There was, of course, the 1968 tribal reconciliation law and the efforts made to reduce tribal affiliation and tribal attitudes, tribal connections and allegiances, which is something that certainly myself, even as a left-wing person, I don't think is a particularly correct attitude, but it happened. And of course, the relations throughout the 70s were very, very tense between Sana'a and Aden, with the exception of the short period when Al-Hamdi was in charge in Sana'a. And of course, there were the two wars between Sana'a and Aden in 72 and 79, which again, we won't go into because they're not essential to the argument that we're talking about today. So basically, you can look at the and then of course, 78 was the ousting of Salmin. So from 72 to 78, you'd had this strong tension going between the Salmin factions, or the very left-wing populist faction, versus the Abdel Fattah Ismail faction, which was considered the more clearly pro-Soviet, pro-bureaucratic faction. And in 1978, this exploded in June when Salmin was killed and ousted immediately after the assassination in Sana'a of al-Rashmi. So you then had, in late 78, the establishment, the formal establishment of the Yemeni Socialist Party, because before that, between 67 and 78, it had been the NLF, and then the NLF this, and the UPONF, and the various other names it took as it joined other people who were, very much connected with these sides. So I think your 1978 to 1980 was the only 2 years when Abdel Fattah Ismail was in charge. He was then packed off to Russia on medical treatment, I think. And as I put it in my book originally, it probably was a wise description because his health might have suffered quite considerably if he had stayed in Aden. But this did not put an end to the struggle, even though Ali Nasser Mohammed was then, by that time, had been the prime minister, the head of the party, the secretary general of the party, and the president of the country. So he had accumulated the three posts, which until 78 had been distributed between Salmin, Abdel Fattah Ismail, and himself. And he was described as the more pragmatic leader and less, with less allegiance of any kind to any of the faction of the Soviet or Chinese sides. And of course, if you look at 1978 and onwards, you know, by that time, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was regarded as a bad thing in China, and the whole Chinese policy had changed very, very considerably. You were already beginning to have the kind of policies that have led to now the kind of situation which is extremely authoritarian, but I think probably couldn't be described, in my view, couldn't be described as socialist in any particular way. So you really had this last decade of the 80s when the regime was first, the struggle continued, but less obviously. The policies were much more moderate in the sense there were no revolutionary moves made. Diplomatic relations were established with Oman in 82, with Saudi Arabia. So the internal struggle had basically, I'd say, shifted from being one based on ideological and actually policies of development, then to one which was much more one of personalities. And one thing that, one of the evidence I have for that is, we had the very big faction fighting in January 1986, which was 3 months after I'd published my book on the PDRY in English. And people said to me, please write a new chapter on what's happened for an Arabic edition, which never happened, but that's another story. So in late 86, 87, I went on various trips to Sana'a and Aden and interviewed leaders on both sides on a number of issues. What were their differences on foreign policy? What were their differences on the policy of cooperatives? What were their differences in social policies? And I asked these questions to probably 30 or 40 leaders on all sides. And I came back with a notebook full of notes and pages and pages and pages of notes. And I wrote my thing saying basically it was all a matter of one guy wanting to sit in the chair that the other guy was holding. It was impossible to really identify any serious political differences between them. So I think what you can say is that after the 86 events, the 86 events had two main impacts. The first one was to very, very largely discredit the regime in front of the Yemeni people. And that was, I think, basically, that was its terminal decline was due to that. Because if you look at the policies that were implemented between 86 and 1990, a lot of them were the kind of policies that many of us these days who consider ourselves social democrats or believe in some kind of democracy and different views and social policies would actually quite approve of. They allowed multi-parties, they allowed a lot of things to happen, but basically due to the discredit, and I think, of course, because it was happening in parallel with the downfall of the Soviet Union and the socialist and basically the Eastern Bloc, these things all contributed. And then you had the sponsorship of the discovery of oil along the border, which basically encouraged the leaderships to get together with the Sana'a leadership, which had its own crises, which we won't go into, and which led to unification in 1990. Now, I would like to spend my remaining minutes so that we can then have more time for discussion rather than questions and answers, but let's have a bit of contributions. I'm sure there are variety of views, and many of them won't agree with mine, but it's good to have debate. But I'd like to talk very much about the most positive elements of that regime. And those were its social policies and its welfare policies. So the first thing to be said to an audience in 2020 is that in the 70s, and certainly in the 60s and earlier, the word welfare was not a dirty word. Nowadays, welfare is really regarded as, I mean, I was shocked when I first discovered this. Welfare was something that people had ambitions to have. One wanted to have, to promote welfare and to have proper social security regimes. And indeed, those had been the main outcomes for the populations, throughout the world. I mean, as I said earlier, East Bloc and West Bloc were competing for popular support through the provision of healthcare, medical services, infrastructure, and trying to a reduction of inequalities to some extent. And, that it was the one argument that was popular on all sides, that you competed as we had better welfare systems than the other side. And the developing countries, once they became independent, also tried to emulate this and to provide welfare structures and welfare regimes in their countries, and not always, they couldn't always afford it. Now, of course, when we look at the Arabian Peninsula, and particularly after 1973 and the oil price rises, we have a situation in which the Saudi and the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, all these regimes were in a position to provide basically the top-notch welfare system. And there it really became, we give you the welfare, we give you those good things, but you will not have any political rights. You can have as much school and education, and I mean, people are getting scholarships to go everywhere. They're getting medical services, to travel, etc. But this comes without any political rights. And I think that was the important thing. But in terms of what they were able to provide in terms of services, it's definitely, very high. And so to look at what happened in the PDRY in that context is that the PDRY, as we've briefly mentioned without going into detail, was a very, very poor country. No oil had been discovered. The Aden port was closed until 75, and by the time it reopened, it never became in any way anywhere near as significant as it had been in terms of earlier. The regime had very little international aid, particularly not from its neighbors, though it got some in the 1980s. It got some support from the Soviet Union, but again, that wasn't necessarily anywhere near as much as what people would have liked. And, the international institutions also provided some economic and social support. But, we were talking about a poor country. And despite this, I think that is, to me, the biggest and the most important achievement of that regime is that it provided its population with adequate basic living standards. In other words, a Yemeni family could live on the salary of the family members who were working, ideally both father and mother in a nuclear household. And this made it possible to have, they had good medical services. You had a medical school that started, that operated, and that provided medical doctors, and you had other medical institutes that provided lower level staff, and they were distributed throughout the country. So you could go to remote places. And remember, PDRY was a country of a very small population, 2.5 million by the time of unification, and with very low population density, very large areas of desert with very little, very small settlements mainly. And so, providing services in these situations was quite an impressive thing. Education, and particularly women's education, was absolutely, fantastic expansion. I mean, I remember that in the 80s, if you walked into the parts of Aden University, you would think you were in a women's college. You hardly saw any men, but it wasn't. I mean, there were, you know, colleges and the institutes, colleges of education existed in the remote governorates. And I think one of the biggest things it did was to set up massive literacy campaigns to get rid of particularly women's illiteracy. And each campaign became more intensive. I mean, there were a whole series of them. There was one, I forget which year it was, I think 83 or 84, when basically students in the vacation were all told to educate 5 or 6 people around them. So they would go to their mothers or to their grandmothers or their cousins, and they would do the training, their literacy classes at home. So that really helped. And I think finally, in terms of, you know, the overall social policies, of course, you had the subsidies on basic commodities, which meant that they were accessible to people. And you had, you know, basically reasonable living conditions. So I think, to be very brief, I would like to say, you know, if you do an assessment of the regime, I think it has to be deplored that there was a very high level of political instability throughout. I mean, if you look at the number of conflicts that took place within 23 years, it's quite impressive. And it's really important to look at the extent to which these were inspired or supported from outside, either from exiles, from Yemeni exiles, or from outside powers. But also there were significant personal rivalries. And I think, you know, again, I was hoping to talk a little bit about tribalism, but I think we've kind of run out of time. But I think it's more important to look at these, you know, not so much in terms of tribalism, because in all tribe situations, you will find people on all sides. And just look at the current situation. You know, you have members of just one that's talked about every day, you know, the Murad tribe around Maghreb. Some are with the Houthis and some are against the Houthis. So, you know, crude saying this tribe is with this group and that tribe is with that group really just doesn't work. But, you know, and again, I have a lot to say on tribalism. I think it's not the time to do this now. I think there's two other, I mean, I think the importance of what was facilitated for women. No women actually got any top jobs. You had deputy ministers women, you had women, a few women in the Central Committee, but, you know, the law, family law and the support of women in terms of work and professional situation was something that was very important. And until, I'd say, well into 2010, you would find most of the women you met, professional women in senior positions you met in Sana'a or anywhere in Yemen, you would find that they had been educated in Aden, you know, obviously if they were of the right age group. So I think if you look at how the regime is looked back today, you know, you have this whole issue of, one of the things that people will say everywhere is we had law and order. You know, there was law and order inside NPDRY, and that's something that certainly vanished after 1990 very quickly, and I think that's very important. Another very important thing is, you know, the availability of basic social services, the possibility of people living off their income, which meant that you had very, very little corruption, if any, because people, certainly ordinary bureaucrats, did not need to be corrupt in order to feed their families, which was not the case later on. So that was, you know, one thing. And I'll just finish by saying, you know, if you look at the people now and at the relevance today, and particularly at the calls for separatism today, there's two things I want to remember. One is that before unification in the 80s, every Southerner you met supported unification. Of the official slogans that were said every morning in the school, you know, and everywhere else, the one on unifying the country was the only one that was really, really popular. And that was a very important element. And I think this, you know, and you have to remember that most Yemenis will have relatives in the other part of the country or in different parts of the country. People have, as we've discussed, migrated back and forth over the decades or even over the century. So I think, the current factionalism that is going on in the South is something that is, not really fundamentally related to unification. It is related to other things. And if you look again, most prominently at the current situation, i.e. the battle or well, there are battles going on daily between the Southern Transitional Council and the Hadi government forces, who are they? The STC are the descendants of the group that won the war in 1986 and that come from one particular part of the Western governorates. And the Hadi faction are come from the group that was defeated in 1986 and that come from another part of the faction, all of them from Shabwa West, none of them East. And again, we won't go into it now on Hadramaut because that's another whole issue. But, this is something that people should bear in mind when they look at the current situation. I think I'll stop here, Noel, give people a chance to talk, and hopefully we'll have some interesting exchanges. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Helen. That was fantastic, and I had a number of questions coming already. I'll start my video, okay. Yeah, the number of questions have been flowing in already, but I'll just start with the first one, which is, I think, essentially was really asking, was the GDR there, I mean, the East Germany, and how important and effective, or how important was the German Democratic Republic in PDRY? Can I just start there? Because the GDR, when I was a diplomat in Aden, the GDR embassy was just opposite us. The West Germans had been thrown out in 1968. There's a very good book by Miriam Müller based on the GDR archives, which actually shows that the East Germans set up a mini Stasi in Aden, and certainly when I was there were advisors working in the Ministry of Interior, and a number of East German experts were there. And also, I think one of the things that struck me, again with both the Germans and the Soviets, was the remarkable degree of contact there was between the leaders, PDRY leaders, and really the top leaders in both countries. It was extraordinary, these personal relationships. And I think a lot of this was due to the fact that I met a Soviet diplomat walking down Maala in 1968, who I'd known from before. I asked him, "What are you doing here?" And he said he was coming to teach at a school being set up by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union with this, to support the NLF by teaching people Marxism, because many people had become were thinking in terms of being Marxist, but the party leadership wanted to make sure that the whole that Marxism was taught much more broadly. Anyway, but do you want to say anything about the East Germans, Helen?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I never came across any East Germans, but they were certainly known to be active in the security sector, and certainly the security system in the PDRY was very efficient, I think, and they were, they knew what everybody was doing, and we didn't have, I forgot to mention that in my early introduction for those who don't know, but we didn't have internet, we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have WhatsApp, we didn't have any of those things in those days. Making international calls was a major effort. But I think that was very much, I mean, I think they were there in that sector, but I don't think they were particularly noticeable in ordinary daily life.
Yeah.
But I think I'm glad you mentioned the teaching of science, because of course it probably happened after you left, but there was a whole big, fantastic building called the School of Scientific Socialism that was built, where indeed the Russians were teaching Yemenis to, to be proper Marxists. And I'd like to add there, one of the issues that I found and which I was concerned about, which is that I never really quite understood and why the Yemenis were so busy following those routes or those analyses of Marxism. And I was always asked myself, and I occasionally asked some of the people I dealt with, why don't you analyze your own situation and draw your conclusions and develop your policies on that basis? Now, people may consider this a naive question. Maybe it is, I don't know. But, what I felt, Abdul Fattah Ismail going off to the back ends of Brehony and talking about, feudalism, it was something that was pretty meaningless. Not that he was a pretty uncharismatic speaker at the best of times, but this was language that meant absolutely nothing to the people there, absolutely nothing. And I always wondered, having done this kind of research myself, there are technical definitions of feudalism, which Yemen did not fit. So, why use these caricatures or why use this kind of language when they could, as socialists believing in equality, in good living standards for the people, they could have developed their own policies and come up with maybe more locally appropriate policies. And I always ask myself that, and I did ask that, but I don't think I ever got an answer.
Yes. I met one very interesting character when I was there, Badi, but it was Abdullah, I think, Ahmed, I can't remember.
Abu Bakr, no, Abdullah, yeah.
Abdullah, who was actually the head of the Communist Party, because, the Communist Party.
The head of the Communist Party was Abdullah.
Abdullah, yeah.
Yeah, and the one who was alive later was Abu Bakr, sorry.
Yeah, I see. Because I think the party school was eventually named after Abdullah. I used to meet him when he was Minister of Education, and it was extraordinary. He was a genuine intellectual that fully understood Marxism, but he was about the only person that I met of the leaders there that did. Can I just ask one thing? One thing that Ali Nasser Mohammed told me when I interviewed him some years ago was the thing that he said you gave us, British, was the administrative system left over from you had developed it for the Federation of Saudi Arabia, but we realized when we saw the laws that we could actually apply this law and establish control over the whole country. Because the thing I don't know if you did mention beforehand, what became PDRY was not a united country in 1967. There was a colony in Aden, Western Protectorates, Eastern Protectorates, all linked by British rule, but very likely administered outside Aden. So it was but within a few years, it became a coherent state, a strong state. And compared, I used to go from Aden to Sana'a in those days, and compared with the North in those days, the PDRY was an organized state with a strong army and a strong state, just as strong as the Yemen Arab Republic, despite the disparity in population.
Noel, I think you're supposed to deal with the questions.
Yes, I was doing. There's a question there that's linked to it. It's linked to the question of.
Which order? I'm looking at them at the moment.
Yeah.
I think we can be selective.
Let's move on to the question. It's from Gabriel van Broek. How would you characterize the relations between the state and citizens? How do the citizens relate to the state's day-to-day running?
Well, I think you had, people. People where there, the basic rule of life in the PDRY is keep out of politics and you can have a really good, not really good, but you have a good living standard, acceptable compared to other third world countries, maybe not compared to Britain or France, but get into politics and that's that could seriously shorten your lifespan and certainly your living conditions. So I think, once you accepted that, I think people had expectations. People expected and got. They had the access to education, they had, slowly, very slowly, but slowly improving infrastructure. They had access to jobs. So people expected these things and got them, because I think the other level, which I didn't get around to mentioning, as pretty hundreds of other things that need to be said, is that people's expectations in Yemen, in the south, were also largely affected by their knowledge of the living standards that were developing in the Gulf states. you already had, you didn't just have the migrants to Europe, but for example, many of the people who'd migrated to Europe in the 60s, when laws became much anti-immigrant in Britain, started shifting to the Gulf. So I knew a lot of people who would do a kind of triangular trips between Yemen, Manchester or Sheffield or Birmingham, and back to the Gulf, and then back, so they would do this sort of this triangular trip. And so people, there was this expectation that, the state should provide the same level of services as were available in the Gulf. And that's another of the arguments I had with many, many people, which even after oil was discovered, trying to explain to people that, and that was in the 90s, that with 200,000 barrels of oil a day for 20 odd million people at that time is totally different from 10 million barrels of oil for the same number of people, even if a lot of it is squandered on gold taps for the bathrooms or whatever, there's still a lot left. And so the expectations were quite high. But I think, the level of delivery, and I think the fact, the gap of living standards between the leadership and the people was so small. I mean, I don't know what your experience was, Noel, but when I visited houses of leaders, they were not luxurious. No. They were not that different from the house of the migrant laborers in Birmingham.
Yeah.
So there was this, absence of corruption, this level of equality and this accessibility of basic services, which I think people respected. And, they didn't, I mean, there was also a lot of thinking of it would be so much better, the grass is greener on the other side of the river sort of thinking. And on that one, I mean, I always remember a guy I worked with in one of the schools where I was teaching, and I bumped into him, and who had been going on at me forever about how things are so much better in Sana'a, how you can do this, how you have the other, etc., and things are bad here. And I bumped into him in Sana'a one day. I said, hi, how are you? And he said, he was on holidays in Sana'a. So I said, how are you finding it? He said, this place is so expensive, I can't take it. I'm going home tomorrow.
Thank you. From Neil Patrick, how effective do you think Saudi financial leverage was after it recognized the PDIY? And how effective was it in affecting PDIY domestic policy? Or was it only interested in, paradoxically, aiding a socialist country to offset the power of North Yemen on its border? Furthermore, could the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia get some money to what tribal elements there were in the south, and thus also weaken the state to some extent?
Find this one on the list.
Sorry?
I mean, I didn't remember all of. Oh, here we are. Yeah. I don't think the financial leverage was that great on domestic policy. I think by the time it came, you already had a certain amount of, you had what you'd call much more less strict policies. And I think it was basically, and also the aid from Saudi was much less than people had hoped for. I mean, I certainly remember people complaining about that. But I think, particularly if you look at what happened later, I mean, the fact that the Saudis supported the Southern separatists, i.e. the same leaders in 1994, I think the second half of your question is not necessarily instead of, but in addition to, it was a way of maybe balancing the relationship. But I think also there was some element of trying to keep, to be in a good position for the future. I think when you're looking at the issue of tribal elements and supporting tribal elements and weakening the state, I mean, that's certainly what they were doing in the 70s. I mean, when they were sponsoring a lot of the people who had emigrated in 67 and in the years immediately after independence, and the tribal leaders and other groups who basically were actively fighting the regime. So they were definitely in the 70s actively undermining trying to undermine the regime. But I think by the time the 80s came along and they did give some aid, the policy was slightly different.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Miles Copeland, in his book, the game player, said Gamal Abdel Nasser was supported by the Americans and molded as the Billy McLean of the Middle East in order to remove British controlled interests from parts of the Middle East. Do you have any insight of any of the British-American struggle in Yemen?
I don't. I mean, the Americans didn't, basically didn't recognize the PDRY, and I'm not even sure, was it the British embassy who was? No, it wasn't the British.
Well, they had an embassy there at the very beginning, but when I was there,
they left immediately. They left in '68.
I was looking after British interests. There was an American embassy there, but it was probably, it must probably be left over from the colonial times.
I forget the date, but we definitely, they did not did not recognize the state. I think as of '68 or '69, and some other embassy was dealing with American interests. I don't know. I thought you'd know. If it was the Brits, you would know.
Yeah, we were dealing with the interests there. I used to.
Okay.
American building there. I think they were thrown out in '68 at the same time.
I think it's '68, but I mean, one would have to check.
Yeah.
I think actually I mentioned it in Yemen in Crisis, so maybe I can find it.
So I'm not sure there was that much rivalry as it came to the PDRY. I think there's a certain amount of American concern in the days before 1967 of British policy in South Arabia, but I didn't find any of that, nor in Oman. I mean, I think that at the time the Americans were leaving, the management of policy, more or less, to the implementation of policy was left in British hands, except of course the Americans did intervene, I think, to some extent in around 1980, I think, when there was problems in the north and some American ships were deployed, were they not, to
in the north, yeah, but not in the
south off what it might do. Linked to the...
Yeah, somebody sent a message saying it was '68.
'68, yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was 68.
Yeah, I certainly used to see their embassy because we were in charge of it. Okay, my questions, I think. Can I see any other questions there? Could I just ask you myself, I mean, could you say something more about tribalism? Because it certainly when I first arrived, it was extremely important. And it was almost, I found that, that the different versions of what stood to be Marxism you could often tell from a conversation with an individual which tribe they're coming from which version of Marxism or was referred to. I thought this was probably at the time linked to relations between the tribe and particular PDRY leaders, but throughout the PDRY times, I'm not sure whether it was tribalism or more regionalism. The rivalries which you talked about were based in particular regions of the South, say Lahij and Dala, but the tribes in those areas were pretty small. It was more groups of leaders, groups of tribes in those areas which were influential. But how successful do you think that the PDRY was in trying to eliminate tribalism, which it certainly set out to do in its early days?
Yeah, no, I think tribalism is considerably misunderstood by many people in many ways. And there is, a widespread prejudice against tribes from people who claim to be modern and different. I mean, tribalism is a form of social organization like any others, and people return to it in certain aspects and not in others. I mean, I think, attributing something to tribalism is a mistake, because it is, I mean, tribal solidarity is a very important phenomenon. And it's the same, solidarity, it's the old story, the people you're closest to, you will support versus the people whom you're more remote from. And it can work as a sort of social security mechanism as well. In the absence of social security, it can go in all kinds of ways of that kind. I mean, I think you have to also look at the way, maybe people from the same region or the same groups had the same teachers, and therefore, had a similar type of thinking, not necessarily that this means that that it's because of being from a tribe. Now, the efforts that the regime made to be anti-tribalist were, as we know, for example, the fact that people didn't use their tribal names, and so people used their names, their father's name, their grandfather's names instead, which tend to not be tribal, because you end up with Mohammed Ahmed Mohsen or something, so that in a way it helps. I think the renaming, one interesting thing about that actually is the renaming of the governorates, because I'll take this thing down, and Ibrahim, if you can show this. This map, if you can, is a tribal map of Yemen. Now you can see how incredibly fragmented it is. And the fact that, the renaming of the, first they were numbered, the governorates. So you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I forget, somebody somewhere recently published saying that number 7 was this small place up in the northern desert, Tamud, yeah. And I had to correct this particular misconception. You probably know, Noel, what the 7th governorate was. No, you don't. It was the name used for the prisons where the political prisoners were kept. But then they were, I forget, sometime in the 80s, they were renamed. So we had Lahej, Abyan, Shabwa. Now, when we look at the situation now, we're talking about Abyan. Abyan's the center of conflict. Well, hang on a minute. We've got Southwest Abyan, Zinjibar and around, which is where the fighting is currently going on, which is Fadli. You have Jar, which is 10 kilometers up the road, which is Lower Yafir. You have Shukra, which is, and then you have Moudia and Lodar and all these different sections up there, which, mean that people are now drawing conclusions on the basis of, as if there is a governorate identity, which is largely absent. It's not entirely absent. Hadramaut has a certain cohesion, though whether that overlaps into Al-Mahra, overlaps into Shabwa, is something that one could discuss in certain cases, or the other way around. There might be, but you have, when you look at the name of the governorates and turning that into an identity today is much more problematic in a way than even using tribal identities. But I'd say that the tribal identity is, and that's what happened in 1986. I think the battle in 1986 was completely a factional battle of who would sit in which chair. And I tell you, I've still got my notebook with the pages and pages and pages of notes trying to identify some serious political differences between cooperatives, foreign policy, and other social policies. But once it went into the streets and people were killing other people because on their identity card it said they were from Abyan or from Lahej, then it turned into that kind of identity, which wasn't necessarily there. Now, on the general question of the ability to eliminate tribalism in a way, which was their objective, I think this is an issue of identity, which is extremely difficult to change and very, very slow to change. And the example I give when looking at that is Yugoslavia. It took decades to build Yugoslavia and to have people walk around saying they're Yugoslavs. And how long did it take to destroy this and turn it into Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians, etc., etc. It's very difficult to build a national identity. It takes a lot of time. It takes, I would say it takes quite a few generations. It's very easy to destroy it. And I think, that there was no way that in the time that the PDRY existed, that they could have achieved that, even under the best of circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Some Kate Nevins, do you think the current Southern movement, the STC, share the same social welfare ideals as in the PDRY?
My impression, and from little I've seen and heard about them, the answer is no. I mean, the only thing that any of those people claim is we want independence. And I've never seen any of them making any kind of programmatic, policies, we will do this with education, we will do that with the economy, we will do X on agriculture, etc. All they say is we want independence. And my perception from what little I've seen and heard of any of the factions going at the moment, and a lot of these people openly say, no, we're not socialists. I'm not sure what they mean by socialist, but if they mean anything like, egalitarian and providing social services and doing good things for the masses, then they're definitely not socialists. That's my perception.
Yeah, Hamdan Damaj makes an interesting point. He says that it's interesting to note that apart from the flag, the SDC seems not to have any form of inclination or link with PDRY, especially politically or economically.
You froze up for a second, so I didn't get everything Hamdan had said.
It's interesting to note that apart from the flag, the SDC does not have any form of inclination or link with PDRY, especially politically and economically.
I find the use of the flag comic. I mean, I just find it farcical. Because it is the flag of the socialists, it has the red star in it to symbolize socialism. And indeed, I mean, I find the whole thing, I totally agree with what he says. I mean, it's, where this flag is, is not, I mean, they're going back the PDRY flag when they're having none of the PDRY ambitions.
No, I suppose it's just a symbol to say when the South was independent and we want to be independent again. I suppose that's what it is, because the South was.
But they could go back to the Federation of South Arabia flag, whatever that was. I can't say I've got any recollection of it.
No, I had a whole series of different flags. I think there was at the end, but there also is a different flags for the many sultanates and emirates that made it up.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, then you'd have dozens of them.
Yeah. Can I ask, from James Russell, what are we to make of the legacy of the PDRY in the context of 2020? Has it had a lasting impact on Yemeni society in the South?
Difficult to say, I would say, at the moment. I mean, I think, certainly it's left a memory. And whether to what extent that memory is a memory and to what extent it's turned into a myth, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I found quite striking in the last decade, in 2012, 11, 13, when I was there last, was I was surprised at the reaction of people, all kinds of people, I mean, shopkeepers or people I was working with or whatever, when they knew I'd lived there. I mean, they tended to be really interested. I mean, suddenly they had a real interest in talking to me, and they had lots of questions. And at the time I wondered why, because they could all ask their parents, or in some cases their grandparents. And in the end, I came to the conclusion that they wanted an outside view that they thought might be not biased in one way or another, but there was a very strong interest, in what had life been like in the PDRY.
Yeah, no, I found that thing. Mark Pellis has commented, the state was, of course, not totally in power, but there was a real state and some kind of a de facto containment of the party personal arrangements, made the state be perceived as much more rational and efficient, given the limited financial resources than the North, a tribal maelstrom, which caused a dimension of lasting nostalgia. And I think there is this, I agree with you, there is this sort of sense of nostalgia for an independent South, but it can be imagined, I find, in very, very different ways according to the experience that the people have had of the regime. And to some, it did it, I think, it's a symbol of Southern identity, although to my mind, the Southern identity has probably increased since the downfall of the PDRY, then and then the PDRY itself.
I think people miss, I think probably most people miss the state as an institution that provides law and order, that is organized, where, where things are not totally unpredictable and unplanned, and where you can rely on that if you do X, Y will happen, and if you don't do Y, Z will happen, etc. Where you have this level, I mean, basically of stability. In some cases, whether you like its stability or not, the fact that you have it and you know where you stand, which is, something that, was never the case. I mean, the example on that I gave was the comparison, between the YAR and the PDRY in terms of checkpoints. When I traveled out of Aden to go somewhere else, it was very simple. I got to the first checkpoint, I had my papers in order, and they would say, Ahlan wa sahlan, please carry on. You get to the first checkpoint, your papers are not in order. They say, we're very sorry. You have to go back to so-and-so and you have to bring X, Y, and Z. Okay, in the north, you get to a checkpoint and you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. At the same checkpoint, you can get waved through without anything being asked. I mean, in those days, you didn't need permits or whatever. In other places you turn up and I had a guy who read my passport upside down, who couldn't read, and then sent me off to the security office in Ramah. And I went to the security office in Ramah, who said, what's your problem? And sent me back. And this guy clearly didn't want me to go anywhere. So he sent me to another security office in Ramah. Finally, the new guy in the second security office actually sent one of his officials with me to get me through the checkpoint. And I'd said all along I was going to Thais for the weekend. I was saying, well, if you don't want me to go, I don't care. I'll go back,
Yes, I lost my internet connection. I don't know what happened. I lost it. But
you got lost, yeah, and I didn't. Amazing. It's usually me who gets cut off. So please take over again.
Yeah, I'll just go back to Q&A. Let me make sure I've got all the questions.
We've done a couple in your absence, but feel free to select whichever one you think is most appropriate.
The moment I can't see the list. I think there were two from the very beginning, which I was keeping to the end because they were very much about the future, which referred from Karen Nebraska.
But I dealt with those two.
Oh, you dealt with those. That's fine.
While you went around.
Okay. Yeah, I was leaving those to the end. But are there any other questions?
Yeah, I see about.
No, that's one on the life of a foreigner.
Oh yes, sorry, yes. That was all I asked. Just as I lost the internet, I was asking what was, the question was, what was the life of the foreigner in PDRY? And I started answering by saying, in my time when I was there, we were British diplomats. We were actually banned from leaving Aden, and we retaliated by forbidding PDRY diplomats to go beyond Park Lane in London. In fact,
Lane, that's a bit tough.
Yes,
I mean,
in fact,
the GLC at least.
Well, it really wasn't implemented. I mean, we were banned, but nobody stopped. I went to Dala and other places without any difficulties.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, my answer to this question: I was not a diplomat. I was an as ordinary a citizen as a foreigner could be in the situation. I think there was a big difference between the situation of diplomats and UN people and those of others. I mean, others basically didn't include, the only other Westerners there were, other than myself, to my knowledge, were the Swedish Save the Children Fund people, the Adibanen people. Other than that, the other foreigners were Sudanese teachers and Sudanese medics and Palestinians and, those people. There were no other Western Europeans, to my knowledge. And I think life was, I mean, I was on a Yemeni salary, so I earned 53 dinars a month, which was about $150 in those days. And so, I could live adequately. But, you know, there were things that were pretty tiresome. You couldn't get every single type of vegetable you wanted every day. You know, you may have had to queue for some of them. The limited, you know, one of the things that helped me stop smoking was coming back to England, because in Aden you had 3 brands of cigarettes: Pall Mall, Radfan and Shamsan. And Pall Mall were the upmarket ones, the Radfan were stronger, and the Shamsan were really unsmokable, at least as far as I was concerned. I came back to England and I was faced, you know, in those days you could see the cigarettes with a wall full of 250 brands of cigarettes, and I just didn't know what to choose, and it helped me stop smoking. So it wasn't, you know, it was, I mean, it was a reasonable life. There wasn't, you know, there was the odd cinema, and I eventually earned enough money to buy a television. So, which was primarily to improve my Arabic, I have to say, because watching the Egyptian serials wasn't that entertaining. But it was, you know, but you did need permissions to go and travel out of Aden, and you did need to do, you know, things. So roughly, I think I'd say, you know, it wasn't expat life as is normally caricatured or believed in the Gulf or in other places. Also partly because it was such a very small community. I mean, there were very few of us.
Yes, I certainly, when I was there, it was a tiny community, but large numbers of Russians and East Germans and Cubans and Chinese who would come out in the evening with their little red book, running around Aden, chanting sayings of Mao, much to the of the poor Adenites. But these were those days you described earlier of the Cold War. But certainly, my experience was that although the regime was apparently hostile, when you met people, and I met Ali Salman Abid as foreign minister and Ali Nasser Mohammed as minister of defense. They were perfectly friendly and welcoming and very nice, almost as if the fighting against the British of a few years earlier had been consigned to history. I cannot see any more questions, but my question and answer screen has gone blank for some reason. So unless Ibrahim or Helen can see any more questions.
I see about 9 of them.
One that we haven't answered already.
Oh no, I guess you've already answered them. Yes, that's.
I think they were all answered. I mean, I've got, according to my list, there's no outstanding questions. So in that case, as we're approaching 7:30, I'm going to suggest that we wrap this up and to say thank you to Helen for such a wonderful lecture.
Just one thing I want to add. Sorry.
Please do.
That a slightly different version, possibly a longer version of this, is going to be published in the Journal of the German Yemeni Society, some point early next year. I should have mentioned that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we all look forward to it. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of everybody here for keeping us all so interested in and like this about that sometimes obscure piece of Yemeni history. But I think well, I have the impression that really was conveyed by this is that the PDRY, you know, was a real state. It had its flaws, it had its major problems, but it was a state. It did establish for a time a good social system, delivered good government services, probably better than services that may exist today, and certainly that existed in the north at the time. And then I hope that's perhaps the state that people should remember, I hope, rather than the personality problems that really brought it down at the end. But thank you very much, Helen. It was a wonderful lecture, and I hope our people enjoyed it. And I'm getting many comments here saying how interesting it was, and thank you to you. Thank you to you. Can I also thank Ibrahim Zanta for setting us up and arranging it, and for you both for coping with my loss of the internet.
Everybody for coming and finding the time when presumably they might be having dinner or breakfast or lunch or something, and for being interested in what happened in Yemen then, and possibly what happens to Yemen in the future, which certainly may not be as may make it look like the good old days. And Ibrahim, particularly, thanks so much, particularly since you're not well.
Okay.
Oh, you're very,
So,
my
Noel,
pleasure.
see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you for organising it and all the work. Thank you.
Very welcome. It was very informative.